anyway, so Orwell went up there and documented all of that and wrote a really powerful piece about the plight of the working class for the English Left Book Club. But then, in the second half of the book, he wrote an analytical essay about the phenomena of middle-class socialism, and he was curious about the typical middle-class socialist intellectual, basically called them tweed-wearing, you know, leather patch wearing, sanctimonious hypocrites fundamentally, and he couldn't understand why the hell people like that would be interested in the plight of the working class, because they shared almost nothing in common with them and had really nothing but contempt for them. And I think that's echoed very much now, say, with the attitude of the Democrats in the US to the working class, which they now treat with complete contempt. And certainly the working class bit them very hard 2 weeks ago, because of course the Rust Belt went Republican. And you know, people are damn desperate in the United States when the unemployed Rust Belt workers vote Republican. You know something's gone seriously wrong. But I know lots of intellectuals like the Democratic left intellectual types, and they're exactly the sort of people that Orwell wrote about. He said that these middle-class intellectual socialists didn't like the poor. They just hated the rich. And that's really different. No, seriously, it's so different. It's a completely different set of motivations. And they claim compassion because there's a social justice warrior type who will be bleeding compassion all over you every step of the discussion. But the hatred for the rich, let's say, or for the successful, or for anybody who has any power or standing or authority of any sort, who's not at the absolute bottom of the dominance hierarchy, has nothing to do with care for the people that are at the bottom. It has everything to do with unbelievable resentment at the daring that there could be anyone else out there in the world that has anything that they don't. And I find it absolutely appalling, especially at the university campuses, because, you know, if you look at the university campus like Yale, because Yale is very much infected by social justice warrior types, those people, the students there who are protesting, are so privileged that it's almost unimaginable, right? They occupy the top 1% of the 1% if you include the dimension of comparison to include, let's say, all the people in the world, which you might as well, and also everyone who has ever lived, and yet they have the gall to complain about that even tinier fraction of the population that has slightly more status than they do right now. Well, and I mean right now, because everyone knows that if you're an 18 or 19-year-old Yale student, you're a baby 45-year-old multimillionaire. And the universities sure know that, the private universities in the United States, and I know this full well from as a consequence of teaching at one for 7 or 8 years, the universities know absolutely that these young people are what would you call it, the ruling class in training, and bend over backwards to treat them properly, because they know full well that by the time they come into their 40s, they're going to be, most of them, many of them, are going to be controlling large fortunes and will be donating heavily to the universities. So, as far as see, they want it both ways, and I've had students like this, they want it both ways. Eh? They want to be members in training of the ruling class and have every privilege that goes along with that, and at the same time, they want to identify with the oppressed, call themselves one of the oppressed, so they can have all the advantages of being oppressed and all the advantages of being powerful at the same time. God, it's sickening. It is. It's appalling. And you know, I was talking to an interviewer named Dave Rubin the other day on YouTube, and Rubin has quite a following, and he was talking to me about the good intentions of the young social justice warriors, and I don't buy that at all. I think that they're being enticed to play this double-edged game that's basically grounded in resentment, and I don't see anything but true compassion in that. And I'm also very skeptical about people's claims to true compassion. If someone comes up to you and says, I'm compassionate, I'm feeling sorry for victimized people, I'm going to do what I can to help them, the first thing I think is, just exactly what makes you think you're so good? Because people aren't good. I'm no Rousseauian, you know. I know from my studies, I know full well that, as Solzhenitsyn said, the line between good and evil goes down every human heart. And just because someone comes up to you and says, well, I'm on the side of the oppressed, does not mean that they are on the side of the oppressed. And I'm sick and tired of hearing that from the social justice warrior end of the conceptual universe. It's like they've established the moral high ground, and anyone who dares to question their motivations or their dialogue or their damned language is immediately put into the category of perpetrator/predator. And I know why that is too, because we've studied this. So there's a personality dimension called agreeableness. There's 5 canonical personality dimensions, by the way. They're very, very well established. I would say it's one of the most fundamental facts of social science. So the first dimension is extraversion. Extroverted people are happy and gregarious and assertive. They like being around people. They're energized by people. And introverts are quiet and reserved. They're not timid. They're quiet and reserved. They'd rather be by themselves. And the company of other people tends to tire them out. And so that's a positive emotion dimension, basically, and people vary in the degree to which they experience positive emotion and their threshold for positive emotion. And the second dimension is a trait called neuroticism, and neuroticism is a negative emotion dimension. And so people who are high in negative emotion or neuroticism have higher levels of avoidance and withdrawal, and that's associated with anxiety and depression, let's say. The third dimension, or our third dimension, is conscientiousness, and conscientious people are industrious and orderly. And orderliness, by the way, is the best predictor of conservative political belief. And the conservatives are orderly. So, and perhaps that comes as no surprise, except it's one thing to say that, and it's another to document it psychometrically and scientifically so that it can be measured. Next dimension is openness, and open people are, you can divide it into 2. They're interested in ideas, that's the intellect component, and they're interested in aesthetics, and that's the artistic component, and so that's another source of fundamental variation. And then the last dimension is agreeableness. And agreeable people are compassionate and polite, and the best predictor of political correct belief is compassion. And the reason that this is so relevant is because it's a maternal dimension. So women are higher in agreeableness than men, and that's biological, by the way. It's not a social construction phenomenon, it's a biological phenomenon. Now we know this because as the Scandinavian countries have become more and more egalitarian in their political landscape and socio-political landscape, the differences in personality between men and women in Scandinavia have been getting larger and larger. And the reason for that, technically speaking, is that if you take a society and you flatten out the socio-political landscape and eliminate all the variation that's a consequence of the environment, you maximize the biological differences. You don't minimize them. And those studies are definitive. And I would say they're also now illegal, thanks to Bill C-16. I'm kidding, and the Ontario Human Rights Commission. I truly believe that. So anyway, so that's some of the background with regards to the work that I do. And about a month ago, 2 months ago, another thing that was happening to me that was kind of strange was that I have this clinical practice. I see people for about 20 hours a week, and I've done that for, it's got to be 20 years. So I've got about 20,000 hours of clinical practice in there. And so about 15% of my clinical practice in the last 5 years have been people who've been driven out of their minds by their politically correct colleagues. I'm serious. And so one was a social worker, and one was a university employee, and the other was a bank employee. And these were sensible people, you know, and they were driven mad. One of them was driven mad by this happened. I swear to you that this happened. So this is at the Toronto Dominion Bank. So she was tortured by an email exchange between her superiors about the term flip chart. And so because they didn't like the term flip chart, and the reason for that, apparently, I didn't even know this, but there's always insults you don't know about, so I guess you learn something every day. Flip is apparently a pejorative that can be used to describe Filipinos. Who knew? And hypothetically, there were some Filipinos who weren't very happy with the word flip chart, and so I received from my client an email string of 13 emails describing flip chart, and it's absolutely oppressive consequence for these hypothetically offended Filipinos, and they decided to ban the word from the bank. Oh, this woman was a refugee from Eastern Europe, from East Germany, and you know, she'd lived through the horrors of the totalitarian East, and well, she just had no way of processing this and couldn't reconcile herself to working in an organization where that sort of thing could actually become a priority. So there was that in the background. And then I got word from another client that the University of Toronto was going to make anti-racism and anti-bias training mandatory for its staff. And that really irritated me because, look, really, you're really going to subject your damn employees to political re-education? You really think that's okay? It's like it's not okay. And so not only is it not okay, but the theory upon which the damn re-education is based is bogus. So all these people talk about this test called the implicit association test that hypothetically shows that people are biased against members of whatever group isn't their own. And there's a fair bit of debate about what that damn test means in the scientific literature, because one of the things that happens is you're faster in associating negative words with a race that isn't yours than you are at associating positive words with a race that isn't yours, for example. But we don't know what that means. It might just be a novelty thing, right? Because novel things for human beings are somewhat dangerous and negative, although they have a positive aspect. And so we don't know if people are doing this association because they're afraid of novelty, or if they're or why they're doing it, and it's not a very reliable test anyways, which means if you give it to the same person more than once, you don't get the same results. But that doesn't stop anybody from claiming that it's a valid indicator of your unconscious racism. Now, you think, and then worse, because now there are educational organizations that have sprung up all over that offer to educate your staff out of their unconscious biases, even though there is no evidence that those unconscious bias training programs work, and there's substantial evidence that they actually make the problem worse. Maybe because people don't like being labeled racists for their implicit attitudes, and maybe because they don't like being trotted before a mandatory anti-racism and anti-bias training program to sort out their souls by their erstwhile employers. And the Human Resources and Equity Department at the University of Toronto is a much more malevolent organization than that. And I'm saying that partly because I found out eventually what equity means, right? Because what the hell does that mean? And for those of you that run organizations or happen to be ensconced within them, you can be sure that your Human Resources and Equity Department is a social justice warrior fifth column, and you better watch the hell out. And I'm warning you about that, and I know what I'm talking about. So anyways, they did go forward with their anti-racism and anti-bias training program despite my complaints and despite me pointing out that they were taking advice from the Black Liberation Collective, which is an organization of I don't know how many people, but it's run by it was organized by two women who are unsavory, is to say the least of it. One of them is a black suprematist who has announced publicly that white people are inferior because they don't have enough melanin in their skin. And hypothetically, melanin is this chemical that enables you to transform cosmic energy into wisdom. And she's tweeted some very, very nasty things. She was also the woman who called a black speaker from Ethiopia at the free speech debate a coon, so that tells you exactly what sort of person she is. And then the second one who established this group is under investigation by the University of Toronto Student Union for embezzling $300,000 from the Student Union, which was 10% of their total budget, and organizing anti-racism demonstrations every time someone tries to call her on it. And they have a website on which they posted their support for let's call them non-violent ways of transforming Canadian society because of its appalling, corrupt, and oppressive nature. And that's the people that the University of Toronto Human Resources and Equity Department are taking advice from. And when I called them on it, they said, well, we don't agree with everything they say. So, yeah, well, maybe you shouldn't be announcing the fact that they're serving as policy advisors to you, because a person who's a bit sensible might think that if one of the major administrative departments of the preeminent, perhaps, educational institution, Canada, is taking policy advice from you on how to train their employees, that might indicate that you have a little bit of support for their goals. But no, that instead of that becoming the issue, what I've been doing is becoming the issue because I'm not going to use the pronouns that radical leftist social justice warriors who are bent on dominating the linguistic landscape insist that I use. And that's the state of the modern university.